Before we start the video, comment where you are watching from, the time you are watching, and which story you like. My name is William Reynolds, and I wish I had never taken that job at the lumber camp. What I found in those ancient pines changed everything I knew about Christmas trees. But I should start from the beginning, back in 1901, when the snows were deep and the Maine forests seemed to go on forever. I wasn't planning to work during Christmas season that year. After my dear wife Mary passed away last spring, I mostly kept to myself in our little cabin near the town of Mill Creek. But when Mr. Thompson from the lumber company came knocking with an offer to lead their Christmas tree cutting crew, the money was too good to pass up. "Best pines in all of Maine," he said, pointing at the dark forest that stretched up the mountainside. "Rich folks down in Boston and New York will pay top dollar for these beauties." I didn't tell him that the local Native Americans avoided those woods, or that even the old-timers in town spoke about the forest in whispers. I just nodded, packed my tools, and headed to the lumber camp the next morning. The camp itself was simple enough, a dozen wooden cabins arranged in a circle, with the cook's cabin in the middle sending up smoke from its chimney all day long. 20 men lived there, mostly young fellows looking to make quick money before Christmas. They were good workers, even if they complained about the cold and the way the wind whispered through the pines at night. My job was to pick out the best trees and guide the cutting crews. We'd work from sunrise to sunset, dragging the pines down to the sledding path where horses would take them to the railway station. The work was hard, but honest. At least, that's what I thought during those first few days. I remember the evening everything changed. We were sitting around the cook fire, warming our hands after a long day of cutting. Old Pete, our cook, was telling stories about his logging days when Jimmy, one of our youngest workers, came running into camp. His face was white as the snow, and his hands were shaking. "Mr. Reynolds," he called out, "you need to come see this. There's something inside one of the big pines we cut today." I followed him back to the cutting area, thinking maybe we'd found a raccoon's nest or some other animal's den. The sun was setting, painting the snow pink and orange, and the shadows between the trees were growing longer. What I saw there, in the fading light, made my blood run cold. The pine we'd cut was ancient, its trunk wider than any I'd seen before. But it wasn't the size that made my hands shake. It was what we found inside, perfectly preserved in the heart of that old tree. A human body, dressed in Christmas clothes that looked at least 100 years old. That was just the beginning of our troubles. If only I'd walked away right then, maybe things would have turned out different. But I had to know more. And in the end, that curiosity was going to cost me everything. That night, none of us slept well. I sent Jimmy to fetch Sheriff Morris from Mill Creek, but the snow started falling heavy, and we knew help wouldn't arrive until morning. We covered the split pine with a tarp and posted 2 men to guard it, though nobody really wanted that job. In my cabin, I lit an extra candle and tried to make sense of what we'd found. The body was that of a man, maybe in his 40s, and he looked like he was just sleeping. His clothes were what struck me most: a fine wool coat with red trim, polished boots, and a green scarf, all styled like the clothes in my grandfather's old photographs. But they were perfect, not aged at all, like they'd been sealed away from time itself. Around midnight, I heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside. It was Tom Bradley, one of the guards. "Mr. Reynolds?" he whispered, his breath making clouds in the cold air. "Something ain't right out there. The trees, they're moving, but there's no wind." I grabbed my lantern and followed him back to the cut pine. The tarp was fluttering slightly, even though the air was still as death. And there was something else, a smell like Christmas morning, pine needles and cinnamon, but somehow wrong, like spoiled food trying to smell fresh. When Sheriff Morris finally arrived the next morning, he brought Doc Wilson with him. The doctor examined the body right there in the snow, his hands shaking as he worked. "This man's been dead for at least 100 years, Doc Wilson said. But he's perfectly preserved, like he was frozen in time. I've never seen anything like it." The sheriff asked us all sorts of questions. Who found the body? Had we seen any strangers in the woods? Did we notice anything unusual before the discovery? I didn't mention the moving trees or the strange smells. It all sounded crazy in the daylight. We were ordered to stop cutting in that section of the forest until the authorities could investigate further. But we had contracts to fill, so we moved our operation about a mile east. I told myself everything would be fine as long as we stayed away from the really old pines. I was wrong about that. 3 days later, we found the second body. This one was in another ancient pine, but the victim's clothes were different. They looked like they were from the 1850s. Same peaceful expression, same perfect preservation. And pinned to his coat was a small note, the paper yellow with age. In shaky handwriting, it read, "The trees know. They've always known." That's when the dream started. Every night I'd see myself walking through an endless forest of Christmas trees. They'd whisper to me, trying to tell me something important. But every time I got close enough to hear their words clearly, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. Some of the men quit after the second body. Can't say I blamed them. But I stayed. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe the forest already had its hooks in me. Either way, I knew I had to find out what was happening in those woods, even if it meant becoming part of the mystery myself. A week passed, and the snow kept falling. We were down to just 12 men now, less than half our original crew. Those who stayed didn't talk much anymore. We'd work in silence, each of us jumping at every creak of a branch or whisper of wind through the pines. The third body we found was different. It was a woman this time, wearing a beautiful Christmas dress from what looked like the early 1700s. Her hands were folded over an old leather book, but when we tried to open it, the pages crumbled to dust. Only the cover remained, with one word still readable: warning. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about all those bodies, each one dressed for Christmas, each one from a different time. They were trying to tell us something, but what? I decided to visit Old Joe, a Native American elder who lived at the edge of town. People said his family had been here longer than anyone could remember. When I reached his cabin the next morning, he was already waiting for me. "I wondered when you'd come," he said, stirring a pot of coffee over his fire. "You've been finding them, haven't they? The sleepers in the trees?" My hand shook as I took the coffee cup he offered. "You know about them?" Old Joe nodded slowly. "My grandfather's grandfather told stories about the pine forest. Said it guards an old secret, something about the real meaning of Christmas trees. Those who learn too much, well," he looked at me with sad eyes, "the forest keeps them." Back at camp that evening, I started looking through old newspapers I'd borrowed from the town library. Story after story about people going missing in these woods, always around Christmas time, going back hundreds of years. That's when Bobby, our youngest logger, came running into my cabin. "Mr. Reynolds, we found 2 more." This time the bodies were together in one massive pine. A man and woman, dressed in clothes from the 1800s. They were holding hands, and both wore the same peaceful expression I'd seen on all the others. But there was something new this time, a map carved into the wood around them. I copied the map onto a piece of paper with shaking hands. It showed our forest, but different somehow. There were markings I didn't understand, and in the center a place marked with a star, the same star we put on top of Christmas trees. That night, the whispers in my dreams got louder. The trees seemed to bend toward me as I walked through the snowy forest in my sleep. They were trying to show me something, trying to tell me about the first Christmas tree and why it was really cut down. I woke up to find pine needles in my bed, even though my cabin windows were shut tight. The forest was reaching out to me, and I knew I was running out of time. Either I would solve this mystery, or I'd join those peaceful sleepers in the trees. And the worst part? Part of me was starting to think that wouldn't be such a bad thing. The map kept drawing me back. I spread it out on my desk, studying it by candlelight. The star in the center seemed to glow against the paper, though I knew that was impossible. Something about its shape reminded me of the old church in Mill Creek, so that's where I went the next morning. Father Michael was sweeping snow off the church steps when I arrived. When I showed him the map, his face went white. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his hands trembling. He led me inside the church and pulled out an old book from behind the altar. "There's something you need to see." The book was ancient, its pages yellow and brittle. It told a story about the first Christmas tree, but not the nice version we all know. This was different, darker. The pictures showed people dancing around a pine tree in the woods, but their faces were full of fear, not joy. Every few years, Father Michael said quietly, someone starts asking these questions. They find the bodies, they see the patterns, and then he stopped talking and just looked at me sadly. Back at camp, things were getting worse. The remaining men said they could hear singing at night, like Christmas carols but in a language no one knew. Pete, our cook, swore he saw lights moving between the trees, like candles floating in the dark. I went back to old Joe's cabin, but he was gone. His neighbor said he'd left suddenly, leaving only a note. The forest calls them home at Christmas. It always has. That night, I couldn't help myself. I took my lantern and followed the map into the woods. The snow had stopped, and the moon was full, making the forest glow silver and blue. As I walked, I noticed something strange. All the trees seemed to be leading to one spot, their branches pointing the way like arrows. I found an old clearing I'd never seen before. In the center stood the biggest pine I'd ever seen, its trunk wider than 3 men standing together. But it was what was carved into the bark that made my blood freeze, pictures telling a story, showing the truth about why we really bring trees into our homes at Christmas. The carvings showed people from different times, all discovering this same secret. And each time, the forest had taken them, keeping them safe inside the trees so they couldn't tell anyone else what they'd learned. As I stood there reading the ancient carvings, snow began to fall again. But this snow was different. It sparkled with a strange light, and each flake seemed to whisper as it fell. The branches above me swayed without any wind, and I could smell that wrong Christmas smell again, stronger than ever. I knew I should run, but my feet wouldn't move. The forest had been waiting for me, and now I was here, standing in the same spot where hundreds of others had stood before me, about to learn the truth that no one was supposed to know. The truth about the first Christmas tree, and why some secrets are meant to stay buried in the dark of winter. The carvings on the ancient pine told a story that made my whole body cold, and not from the winter air. Long ago, before Christmas was Christmas, people didn't bring trees inside their homes. They were afraid of them. They knew what lived in the forest, what watched from between the dark branches. But then, someone got a clever idea. If they cut down the trees and brought them inside, decorated them with lights and bells, maybe they could pretend the forest wasn't scary anymore. Maybe they could forget what they knew about the old magic that lived in the woods. As I read the carvings, my lantern started to flicker. The whispers in the falling snow grew louder, and I could finally understand what they were saying. They were names, hundreds of names, all the people who had discovered this truth before me, all the people now sleeping inside the trees. I heard footsteps in the snow behind me. When I turned, I saw old Joe standing there. But he looked different, younger somehow, like time was running backwards around him. "Now you know," he said softly. "The trees never forgot what we did, trying to turn their magic into something safe and pretty. Every Christmas, they remind someone. And every Christmas, they keep that person safe, so the truth stays secret." "Safe?" I whispered. "You mean trapped." He shook his head. "Look at their faces, William. Every body you found, were they scared? Or did they look peaceful?" He was right. Every single one had looked happy, like they'd finally understood something wonderful and terrible at the same time. I started to feel strange, like I was floating. The snow swirled around me, glowing with that odd light. I could smell pine needles and cinnamon, but it didn't seem wrong anymore. It seemed right, like coming home after a long time away. "The forest has chosen you this Christmas," old Joe said, his voice fading like he was moving away, though he hadn't taken a step. "It's not a punishment, William. It's a gift. You'll be part of something older than Christmas itself." I looked down at my hands. They were starting to shimmer like the snow. All around me, the ancient pines were creaking, their branches reaching toward me like welcoming arms. I thought about my empty cabin, about my life since Mary died. I thought about all the Christmas mornings yet to come, all the families who would gather around their decorated trees, never knowing what those trees really meant, what they really were. And I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I could feel the forest's magic moving through me now, changing me. Soon I would sleep in one of these ancient pines, dreaming endless winter dreams. And someday, years from now, someone else would find me, dressed in my best clothes, with a peaceful smile on my face. Because now I knew the truth about Christmas trees, about the forest, about everything. And the truth was beautiful. The morning after I disappeared, they found my lantern in the snow. The search parties looked for 3 days, but the forest had already taken me. I was becoming part of something bigger, something older than time itself. I can still remember how it felt. The ancient pine opened for me like a door, its wood as soft as sleep. There was no pain, no fear, just a gentle feeling, like being wrapped in a warm blanket on a cold night. As the tree closed around me, I could feel all the others who had come before, their memories becoming part of mine. Now I know why we really started bringing trees into our homes at Christmas. We were trying to make peace with the forest, trying to tame something wild and wonderful that was never meant to be tamed. Every Christmas tree is a reminder of that first attempt. Every ornament a tiny peace offering to the old magic that still lives in the woods. I'm not alone here in my pine tree. I can feel the others nearby. The woman in the 1700s dress, the couple holding hands, all of us together in our wooden sleep. Sometimes, when Christmas gets close, we can hear the living world outside. Children laughing, sleigh bells ringing, families singing carols. It makes us smile in our dreams. Last week they found me, a new group of loggers, cutting Christmas trees just like I used to do. I heard their saw biting into my pine, felt the cold air as they split the wood. I imagined their faces when they saw me, perfectly preserved, smiling in my Sunday best. By now, the sheriff will have come, just like when I found the others. The mystery will deepen, and the forest will wait for the next person curious enough to seek the truth. They won't find what they're looking for in the newspapers or history books. The real story is here, in the shadows between the pines, in the whispers of falling snow, in the peaceful faces of those who learned too much and became part of the forest's secret. So this Christmas, when you bring a tree into your home, look at it closely. Those green needles might be hiding centuries of secrets. Those branches might have seen more than you could ever imagine. And somewhere in these woods, I'm still here, keeping the truth safe in my endless winter dreams. Just remember, if you're walking in a snowy forest and you hear Christmas carols in a language you don't know, if you smell pine needles and cinnamon in a way that seems somehow wrong, turn around. Go home. Decorate your Christmas tree and pretend it's just a tree. Because if you learn what I learned, if you find what I found, well, there's always room for one more in the forest's collection. And once you understand, you might not want to leave. After all, I didn't. My name is Eleanor Blackwood, and I was the last headmistress of the Whitechapel Children's Home. What happened there in the winter of 1889 still haunts me, though I suppose that's a strange thing to say, considering I'm now as frozen as the building itself. But I should start at the beginning, back when I thought running an orphanage was simply about keeping children fed, clothed, and properly behaved. I remember that first morning in December like it was yesterday. The air was biting cold, and the fog hung so thick over London that you could barely see your hand in front of your face. I stood in my office, warming my hands by the small coal fire, watching the orphanage courtyard through frosted window panes. The children were filing in for morning prayers, their breath making little clouds in the freezing air. I was strict with them, yes, perhaps too strict, looking back. But life isn't kind to orphans in London, and I thought I was preparing them for the harsh world ahead. Stand up straight, I would say, tapping my cane against the floorboards. A proper posture leads to a proper life. The children would scramble to obey, their little spines going rigid as rulers. That was before I found the music box. It was tucked away in the headmistress's desk. My desk now, in a drawer I hadn't even known existed. I discovered it while searching for old enrollment papers. The box was made of dark wood, with intricate carvings of snowflakes and what I thought were dancing children. When I opened it, the melody that played was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was beautiful, yes, but somehow wrong, like a lullaby being sung underwater. Little Mary Winters was helping me sort papers that day. She was a clever child of 8, with bright eyes and a quick smile. When she heard the music, she tilted her head and said, "It's teaching me words, Miss Blackwood." I didn't understand what she meant then. How could I? I couldn't hear the words she heard, only the melody. But Mary started humming it, then singing softly under her breath. The carol she sang was about snow and starlight and endless dancing. I should have closed the box right then. I should have thrown it into the fire. But I didn't. Within days, all the children were singing it. They would gather in the corridors after bedtime, their small voices joining together in that haunting tune. When I scolded them to sleep, they would go quietly, still humming. I told myself it was harmless, just a Christmas carol spreading through the orphanage, as they often do during the holiday season. Then Mary disappeared. We searched everywhere. The police came, but there were no footprints in the snow outside her window, no sign of how a child could vanish from a locked room on the 3rd floor. The other children kept singing the carol, and I noticed something terrible. They were singing it differently now, with words about hunger and darkness and an ancient promise that had to be kept. That's when I started looking through the old records, trying to understand why every headmistress before me had written about snow and songs and children who were placed with families during the coldest nights of winter. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Perhaps I should explain about the hidden room I found beneath the chapel and the markings on the walls that were clearly made by children's hands. I know now why they chose me to run this place. I just wish I had known sooner. The night after Mary disappeared, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that tune floating through the halls. Tap, 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 tiny footsteps in the corridor, then silence. When I went to check, no one was there. Just cold air and moonlight on empty floorboards. I started keeping a list in my diary. Mary Winters, gone on December 3rd. Thomas Cooper disappeared December 7th. Sarah and Jane Mills vanished December 10th. Each child who disappeared had been singing that carol. Each one had pressed their faces against the windows at night, watching the falling snow with strange smiles. I should have noticed sooner how their eyes had changed, becoming pale, almost white, like frost on morning grass. Mrs. Potter, our cook who had been at the orphanage for 30 years, acted like nothing was wrong. "Children come and go," she'd say, stirring her soup pot. "Best not to ask questions, Miss Blackwood." But I saw how her hands shook when she heard the carol, how she crossed herself when she thought no one was looking. I started following the sound of singing at night. It led me to odd places, behind the old bookcase in the library, beneath the creaky floorboards in the east wing, and finally to a door I'd never noticed before. It was small, child-sized, hidden behind a tapestry in the chapel. The door was locked, but I had all the keys, or I thought I did. None of them worked, but when I pressed my ear against the wood, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Children laughing, but not like normal children. It sounded like icicles breaking. That's when I started going through the old headmistress's journals. They were kept in a brass-bound chest in my office. Dozens of them, dating back to 1789. Each one told the same story, though the writers tried to hide it. Winter comes hungry, wrote Headmistress Clark in 1823. The carol must be sung, the offering made. 5 this year, noted Headmistress Webb in 1856. The snow stays gentle when fed. I couldn't believe what I was reading. But then I found the photographs, old yellowed things showing each headmistress standing in front of the orphanage. They were all wearing the same necklace, a silver snowflake I'd found in my desk drawer the day I started. The necklace I was wearing right now. Yesterday, little William started singing the carol. He's only 6, with red hair and missing front teeth. This morning he asked me if I could hear them, calling from behind the walls. Tonight is the longest night of the year. I won't let them take William. I won't be like the others. But as I write this, snow is falling harder than I've ever seen. The wind is whispering words that sound almost like names. And somewhere in this building, I can hear that music box playing its terrible song. I spent that night in the chapel, trying to find a way through the small door. Around midnight, I noticed something odd. When the moonlight hit the snowflake necklace, it cast strange shadows on the wall, shadows that looked like words. I held up the necklace to the moonlight and followed where it pointed. The shadows led me to a loose stone in the chapel floor. My hand shook as I pulled it up, revealing a narrow staircase that went down into darkness. I probably should have waited until morning. I probably should have called the police. But all I could think about was William, and how his voice had started to sound hollow when he sang that carol. The stairs seemed to go down forever. My candle barely lit the way, and the walls were covered in scratches. Some looked like words, others like desperate marks made by small fingers. The air got colder with each step, until I could see my breath freezing in front of me. At the bottom, I found a room that looked like a library, but not like any library I'd ever seen. The books were bound in strange, pale leather, and the shelves were made of black ice that never seemed to melt. A large mirror hung on one wall, its surface clouded with frost. That's where I learned the horrible truth. The books told the story of an ancient being that lived in the endless cold beyond our world. Hundreds of years ago, it had tried to turn our world into a frozen wasteland. A group of people stopped it, but they couldn't destroy it completely. Instead, they made a deal. As long as it was fed with young souls who knew its song, it would keep winter normal, 3 months long instead of forever. The orphanage was built as a feeding ground. Each headmistress was chosen to be a keeper of this terrible secret. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the book when I read about what happened to the children. They weren't killed. That would have been horrible enough. They were changed, turned into something between ice and spirit, forever dancing and singing in that frozen realm beyond the mirror. I saw them then, in the mirror's surface, faces pressed against the frost from the other side. Mary was there, and Thomas, and the Mills sisters. Their eyes were like stars, their skin pale as snow. They were dancing, always dancing, to that terrible carol, Miss Blackwood. A small voice called from the stairs. I can hear them singing. They want me to join them. It was William. I turned to see him standing there in his nightshirt, his eyes already turning white at the edges. Behind him, the music box sat on the bottom step, playing its melody. I hadn't brought it down with me. Somehow, it had followed us. The room grew colder. In the mirror, I saw something moving behind the children, something tall and ancient, with eyes like winter stars and fingers made of icicles. It had been waiting all this time, watching me learn its secrets. I grabbed William's hand. It was cold, so cold. "Run," I whispered. But as we turned to flee, the music box's song grew louder, and the mirror's surface began to ripple like water about to freeze. I pulled William back up the stairs as fast as I could. The mirror's surface rippled behind us like a pond in winter, and I could hear ice cracking somewhere in the darkness. The music box's song echoed off the walls, getting louder and louder. We made it to my office, where I locked the door and wrapped William in a blanket. His skin felt like snow, and his eyes were getting whiter by the minute. I can still hear them, Miss Blackwood, he whispered. They're saying I have to go back. I knew I had to think fast. The other headmistress's journals were still on my desk, and I started flipping through them desperately. There had to be someone who tried to stop this. There had to be a way out. That's when I found the hidden notes of Headmistress Rose from 1801. She'd written them in the margins, so small you could barely see them. The song is the key. What is sung can be unsung. But as I read this, the temperature in the room dropped so fast the windows frosted over. There, written in the frost, were words I'll never forget. The price must be paid. Suddenly, all the candles went out. In the darkness, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Not the quick steps of children, but slow, heavy steps that made the floorboards crack with ice. Miss Blackwood. William tugged at my sleeve. Someone's coming. The door handle began to turn, even though I'd locked it. Frost crept under the door like white fingers reaching for us. The music box's song was everywhere now, coming from the walls themselves. That's when I saw her, the reflection of the previous headmistress in my window. She looked just like her photograph, except her eyes were white as snow and her skin was blue with cold. We all tried to fight it, she said, her voice like breaking icicles. We all thought we could save them, but winter must be fed. Behind her reflection, I could see others, all the headmistresses who came before me, stretching back into darkness. They were all frozen, all changed, all part of the winter now. The children dance forever, they whispered together. They keep the world from freezing. This is the price. This is the bargain. William's hand was getting colder in mine. The music box's song was inside my head now, trying to make me understand why they all gave in, why they all decided it was necessary. But I remembered something else from Headmistress Rose's notes. The heart that keeps winter at bay must be a willing one. The footsteps were right outside our door now. Ice was spreading across the floor, climbing up the walls. William was shivering so hard he could barely stand. I made my decision then. I wouldn't be like the others. I wouldn't send children to dance in the cold dark forever. There had to be another way. And that's when I remembered the most important thing about any song. It can be sung backwards. I pulled William close and whispered, "Cover your ears, dear. Don't listen to anything but my voice." Then I started to sing the carol backwards, one word at a time. The effect was instant. The ice creeping up the walls stopped. The ghostly headmistresses in the window screamed without sound. The door flew open, and there it stood, the winter thing, tall as the ceiling, made of swirling snow and darkness. "You dare?" Its voice was like wind howling through empty streets. The bargain must be kept. Winter must be fed. But I kept singing backwards, my voice getting stronger. Each word felt like ice in my throat. The thing reached for William with fingers made of frost, but I stepped between them. "Stop," it commanded. "You don't know what you're doing. Without the children's dance, winter will rage forever. Is that what you want?" I saw Mary's face in my mind, and Thomas's, and all the others who had been taken. I thought of William, nearly frozen beside me. "There has to be another way," I said, then went right back to singing. The backwards carol was working. I could feel it. The music box's melody was getting tangled, confused. The winter thing shrieked, and the window shattered inward. Snow whirled around us like a tornado. That's when I understood what Headmistress Rose meant about a willing heart. The bargain didn't need children. It just needed a heart strong enough to hold back winter's anger. And it needed that heart to choose freely. "Take me," I said, my voice rough from singing. "Take me instead of them. Let the children go, and I'll dance in their place." The thing tilted its head, ice cracking as it moved. "All of them? Even the ones already taken?" "All of them," I said firmly. "Every single one. Let them live normal lives, grow old, be warm. I'll keep your winter in check." It considered this for what felt like forever. Then it nodded, just once. The room exploded with light and cold. I saw the missing children appear, stumbling and confused but alive, their eyes normal again. William's hand grew warm in mine. "Run," I told them. "All of you run. Get everyone out of the building." As they fled, I faced the winter thing and sang the last words of the backwards carol. Ice crawled up my legs into my heart, but I kept singing, putting all my love for those children into each word. The orphanage froze around me, every room, every hallway turning to solid ice. Beautiful, really, like a palace made of crystal. The winter thing and I became part of it. Me to keep the bargain, it to keep its promise. Now I stand here, in eternal ice, holding back the endless winter. The children grew up, lived their lives. Sometimes their grandchildren walk past this frozen building and wonder about the stories of the singing ice that keeps the winters mild. And if you listen carefully on cold nights, you might hear a carol being sung backwards, keeping us all safe from the dark and cold that hungers beyond the edge of winter. But whatever you do, don't try to learn the words. They say if you walk down Whitechapel Street on a winter's night, you'll find a building unlike any other. It stands silent and still, completely covered in ice that never melts, even in summer. The windows sparkle like diamonds, and the walls shine blue in the moonlight. Most people hurry past it. They say it makes them shiver, not from cold, but from something else they can't explain. But the older folks in the neighborhood, the ones who were children back in 1889, they know the truth. William Cooper, now a grandfather with white hair and kind eyes, sometimes brings his grandchildren to see it. "That's where Miss Blackwood saved us," he tells them, his voice soft with memory. "She's still in there, keeping us all safe." The other children who escaped that night grew up strong and happy. Mary Winters became a school teacher. Thomas opened a bakery that's still running today. The Mills sisters traveled the world together. None of them ever sang another carol. Sometimes, on the coldest nights of winter, people say they can see a woman's figure through the ice, standing at the highest window. She looks out at the city, making sure the winters stay gentle and short. If you watch long enough, you might see her smile. The music box was never found. The small door in the chapel disappeared. The brass-bound chest of headmistress's journals turned to solid ice, keeping their dark secrets frozen forever. But one thing remains. Every year, when the first snow falls, all the children in the neighborhood wake up to find small snowflake shapes made of frost on their windows. They're not scary shapes. They're beautiful, like promises that spring will always come again. And if the winters in London seem milder than they used to be, well, now you know why. There's a woman frozen in time singing her backwards carol, keeping an ancient bargain so children can play in the snow without fear. Just remember, if you ever hear an old music box playing a tune you've never heard before, close it quickly, walk away, and be grateful for Miss Blackwood, the last headmistress of the Whitechapel Children's Home, who found a better way to keep winter kind. My name is Father Thomas Aldrich, and I wish I had never come to the village of Crewmow. What happened here during my first Christmas as the village priest still haunts me, and I feel I must write it down before the memories drive me mad. It all started on a cold September morning in 1923. The train dropped me off at a tiny station, where an old horse cart was waiting to take me up the mountain. The driver barely spoke 2 words to me during the whole 2-hour journey. He just pointed his whip at the village when it finally came into view through the pine tree. Crewmow looked like something from a fairy tale, but not the happy kind. Gray stone houses with red roofs huddled together in the valley, and the church's tall spire rose above them all like a warning finger pointing at the sky. Thick forests surrounded everything, and the mountains loomed over us like sleeping giants. The villagers didn't exactly welcome me with open arms. They nodded politely when I passed, but their eyes never quite met mine. Children would stop playing and run inside when they saw me coming. At first, I thought it was just because I was the new priest, replacing old Father Heinrich, who had served here for 30 years before passing away in his sleep. The church itself gave me an odd feeling from the start. It was beautiful, yes, with its ancient stone walls and stained glass windows, but something felt wrong. The air inside was always too cold, even when I lit all the candles. And the nativity scene, I've never seen one quite like it. Most churches put up their nativity scenes for Christmas, but this one stayed up all year round. The figures looked so real, almost like they were watching me. I especially couldn't shake the feeling about the shepherd figure. Something in his face seemed familiar, like someone I should know. One evening, while I was cleaning the church records room, I found an old diary hidden behind some books. It belonged to Father Heinrich. Most of the writing was about normal church business, but one entry caught my eye. It said, "Another one gone at midnight mass. God forgive me, but it must be done." The page was dated exactly 1 year ago, on Christmas Eve. That's when I started asking questions. But every time I brought up past Christmas services or the nativity scene, the villagers would quickly change the subject or remember somewhere else they needed to be. Even the baker's wife, who usually loved to chat, went quiet when I asked why some families had empty chairs at their dinner table. I knew I should probably leave it alone. My job was to lead prayers, comfort the sick, and keep the church clean. But something was very wrong in Krumau, and as the days grew shorter and December came closer, I could feel time running out. If only I had known then what I know now, I would have left on that same horse cart and never looked back. But I stayed, and now I must tell you what I discovered about the midnight mass, the missing villager, and the terrible choice that every priest in Krumau has had to face. I started digging deeper into the mystery as winter crept closer. Every Sunday when I rang the church bells, fewer and fewer people came to service. They all had excuses: too much work, not feeling well, the weather's too cold. But I could see the fear in their eyes when they looked at the church. One evening, old Mrs. Weber came to confession. She was shaking as she sat behind the screen. "Father," she whispered, "my brother disappeared during midnight mass 10 years ago. 1 minute he was kneeling next to me, praying. The next minute gone, just like the others?" I asked, my heart beating faster. "How many others?" She wouldn't say more, just crossed herself and hurried out of the church. But her words kept me up that night. I went back to Father Heinrich's diary and started counting. Every year, like clockwork, someone vanished during Christmas midnight mass. No bodies were ever found. The strangest part? After each disappearance, a new figure would appear in the nativity scene. I hadn't noticed it before, but when I looked closely at the figures now, they all wore clothes that matched descriptions of the missing villager. The shepherd with the familiar face, he was wearing a coat just like the one Mrs. Weber described her brother wearing the night he vanished. I found more of Father Heinrich's letters hidden in his old room above the church. Most were normal, talking about the weather, asking for supply. But one letter, dated just before he died, made my blood run cold. It said, "The price must be paid each Christmas. 1 soul to save man. The village was cursed long ago, and this is our burden. When you hear the bells toll at midnight, you must choose. If you don't, we all pay the price." I couldn't sleep after reading that. Every night, I'd hear strange sounds coming from the church, like wood creaking or people whisper. Sometimes I'd go down to check, but I'd only find the nativity figures, their painted eyes somehow looking sadder each time. The villagers must have noticed me snooping around because they started leaving little warning. I'd find notes slipped under my door saying things like, "Some questions are better left unanswered," and "Don't break the circle." But I couldn't stop. I had to know the truth. December arrived, bringing heavy snow that trapped us all in the village. The nativity scene seemed to watch me more closely now. Sometimes when I was alone in the church, I could swear I saw tears rolling down the wooden faces of the figures. And at night, in the quiet hours, I thought I heard them whispering prayer. Christmas was coming, and with it, midnight mass. I knew now that something terrible would happen, something that had been happening for years, but I still didn't understand why. What was this curse? What kind of deal had the first priest made? And most importantly, could I stop it without dooming the entire village? The answers were somewhere in this church. I just had to find them before Christmas Eve arrived. But with each passing day, the shadows grew longer, the whispers grew louder, and I felt less and less sure that I would survive learning the truth. With only 3 days left until Christmas Eve, I finally found what I was looking for. I was cleaning the church basement when my broom hit a loose stone in the floor. Behind it was a small box wrapped in old leather. Inside, I found a letter dated 1823, exactly 100 years ago. It was from the first priest of Krumau, Father Marcus. His handwriting was messy, like he'd written it in a hurry. What I read made my hands shake. The winter of 1823 had been the worst anyone had seen. Food was running out, and a strange sickness was killing the villagers. One night, Father Marcus wrote, something came to him in the church. He didn't say what it was, just that it had eyes like burning coal and a voice like falling stone. This thing offered him a deal. It would protect the village from all harm. No more sickness, no more bad harvests. No more avalanches from the mountains. One soul every Christmas, taken during midnight mass. Father Marcus took the deal. The sickness vanished overnight. The winter storm stopped. But at midnight mass that Christmas, a young woman disappeared. The next morning, a new figure appeared in the nativity scene, wearing the same dress as the missing woman. I dropped the letter and ran to look at the nativity scene again. Really look at it. The faces weren't just familiar. They were perfect copies of the missing villager. Somehow, the thing that made the deal was turning people into wooden figures, freezing them forever in a scene of holy peace. That's when I heard someone behind me. It was Hans, the old gravedigger. He looked tired and sad. So now you know, he said quietly. Every priest before you learned the truth too late. At midnight mass, you have to choose someone, or the deal is broken. And if the deal breaks, he shook his head. The thing in the darkness will take everyone. But it's wrong, I said. We can't just sacrifice people. Hans looked at me with pity. Krumau has survived for 100 years because of this deal. One soul each year, or hundreds dead from avalanches, sickness, and starvation. Every priest has made the same choice. I spent that night reading through more old papers. The deal had rules. The priest had to choose the soul freely. The person had to be in the church at midnight. And most importantly, once chosen, there was no going back. But as I read more, I noticed something odd. The thing in the darkness had made the deal for 100 years. This Christmas would be the 100th midnight mass since Father Marcus's choice. Maybe that meant something. Maybe there was a way out. But I only had 2 days left to figure it out, and I could feel something watching me from the shadows of the church. Something waiting. The wooden figures in the nativity scene seemed to be trying to tell me something. Their faces looked more alive at night, their eyes following me as I paced the church floor, trying to think of a way to save everyone. But time was running out. Soon, the bells would ring for midnight mass, and I would have to make a choice that would haunt me forever, or find another way to break this terrible curse. Christmas Eve arrived with the heaviest snowfall I'd ever seen. The whole village was buried in white, and the church bell tower looked like a dark needle pointing up through a blanket of snow. I spent the whole day in the church, reading and rereading every paper I could find, looking for any way out of this nightmare. Around sunset, I found something interesting in Father Marcus's diary. He wrote about marking the chosen one with blessed oil before each midnight mass. That's how the dark thing knew who to take. Every priest before me had marked someone during the evening blessing, choosing who would disappear. My hands were shaking as I got ready for the evening service. The church filled up slowly. Everyone in the village came, even though they knew what might happen. They had no choice. Staying away wouldn't save them. If no one was chosen, everyone would die. I watched them come in, snow melting on their coats, fear in their eyes. Parents held their children close. Young couples gripped each other's hands. Nobody wanted to sit alone. The nativity scene seemed to glow in the candlelight. All those wooden faces watching, waiting. Then I saw it, something I'd missed before. Behind the nativity scene was a small mark carved into the wall. It matched a drawing in Father Marcus's diary. He called it a doorway mark. This was how the thing took people, through this hidden door between our world and somewhere else. I knew then what I had to do. The thing in the darkness had made a deal for exactly 100 years. This was the last midnight mass. If I could keep anyone from being taken until after midnight, maybe the deal would end. Maybe we could all be free. But as I walked down the aisle, swinging the incense burner, I felt something cold brush against my face. The candles flickered. In the shadows behind the altar, I saw 2 red dots glowing like coal. It was here, watching, waiting for me to make the mark. My voice shook as I started the prayers. Every minute felt like an hour. The air got colder and colder. The wooden figures in the nativity scene seemed to move slightly, like they were trying to warn me, or beg for help. In the back of the church, something dark moved in the shadows. I could hear it whispering, promising terrible things if I didn't choose someone, promising to destroy everything if I broke the deal. The clock ticked closer to midnight. I hadn't marked anyone with the oil. People in the pews started shifting nervously, looking around, wondering who would disappear this year. That's when little Maria Weber, Mrs. Weber's granddaughter, screamed and pointed at the nativity scene. The wooden faces were crying real tears, and behind them, through the doorway mark, I could see something moving, something big and dark and angry. The clock began to strike midnight. I had to make a choice, right now. Save one person or risk everyone? Break the curse or keep the village safe for another 100 years? I gripped my cross and started to pray. But I wasn't praying for guidance anymore. I was praying for forgiveness for what was about to happen. The church bells kept ringing. 1, 2, 3. I stood at the altar, watching in horror as dark shadows crept across the walls like spilled ink. The candles sputtered and died one by one. 4, 5, 6. "Father, do something," someone shouted from the pews. The whole congregation was on their feet now, but nobody dared move toward the doors. 7, 8, 9. The thing in the darkness was getting closer. I could feel its anger like a cold wind. How dare I try to break its deal? How dare I risk the whole village? 10, 11. Just before the final strike of midnight, I saw the nativity scene figures move. Not just little movements now, they were turning their heads to look at me. Their wooden lips moved, and I heard them whisper in the voices of all the people who had disappeared. "Free us." The 12th bell rang. That's when everything went wrong. The thing in the darkness roared, a sound like an avalanche mixed with screaming. The doorway mark behind the nativity scene began to glow with an awful red light. "Run!" I shouted to the congregation, but it was too late. The thing's power spread through the church like a wave of ice. I watched in horror as the people nearest to me began to change. Old Mrs. Weber was the first. Her skin turned brown and hard, her fingers stiffened into wood. The look of terror on her face froze into a peaceful smile, like all the other nativity figures. Everyone tried to run, but the doors wouldn't open. One by one, they all began to change. Parents reached for their children, lovers held each other, friends gripped hands, all turning to wood where they stood. I couldn't move. I couldn't help. I could only watch as my entire congregation became a giant nativity scene. Their faces all wore the same peaceful look, but their eyes stayed alive, looking at me with sadness and understanding. The thing in the darkness laughed. I felt it behind me, its burning eyes reflecting in the gold cross on the altar. "The deal is broken," it said in its voice of falling stones. "But I like this ending better. Now they'll all stay here forever, frozen in prayer. A perfect midnight mass that never ends." It disappeared after that, taking its shadows with it. The church grew quiet. Morning light started to creep through the windows, shining on dozens of wooden figures frozen in their final moments. I'm the only one left, the only one who can tell this story. I've tried everything to break the spell, to bring them back. Nothing works. They're still here, in the church. Still praying, still waiting. Sometimes at night, I think I can hear them singing hymns very softly. Sometimes I see tears on their wooden cheeks. And sometimes when I'm about to give up hope, I see their eyes move, just a little, and I know they're still in there somewhere. I don't know if anyone will believe this story. I'm not sure I would if I hadn't lived it. But if you're ever in the mountains of Austria, and you find a village called Krumau, don't go into the church. Don't look at the nativity scene. And whatever you do, never attend midnight mass on Christmas Eve. Because they're still there, all of them. And the thing in the darkness? It's still waiting too, ready to add new figures to its collection. My name is Lady Victoria Weatherby, and I live in the biggest house on the Bavarian mountains. Some people call it a mansion, but I prefer to call it my museum. You see, I'm not like other rich ladies who collect pretty jewelry or fancy dresses. No, I collect something much more interesting, things that remind me of Christmas, but not the nice, cheerful parts. I collect the dark and scary bits that most people try to forget. My house sits all alone at the top of a snowy mountain. The closest village is 2 hours away by horse, which means I rarely get visitors, especially in winter. But that's just how I like it. It gives me more time to focus on my collection. You should see my collection room. It's my pride and joy. I keep it in the east wing of the house, behind big wooden doors that creak when you open them. Inside, glass cases line the walls from floor to ceiling. Each one holds something special. Old wooden masks with scary faces, bells that ring by themselves on cold nights, and dolls that seem to watch you when you walk past. My favorite part is how I arrange everything. Each piece tells a story about how bad children get punished during Christmas time. Every culture has these stories, you know. Parents use them to scare their kids into being good. But I know these aren't just stories, they're real. At least, that's what I've always believed. Lately, though, strange things have been happening in my house. My servants whisper about hearing children crying at night, but when they look, no one's there. Things in my collection room move around when no one's watching. And sometimes, when I'm alone with my treasures, I swear I can hear tiny voices begging to go home. But those are just silly stories, right? At least, that's what I kept telling myself until I got my hands on the real prize, an actual Krampus mask. That's when everything changed, and I learned the terrible truth about my beloved collection. Want to know what happened? Well, let me tell you about the day the mask arrived. It all started on a cold December morning, just a few weeks before Christmas. It was snowing hard that morning when I heard someone knocking at my front door. That was strange because nobody ever visits me up here, especially not in such bad weather. Through the frosted window, I could see a small man wrapped in a thick black coat, holding something wrapped in old brown paper. "Lady Weatherby?" he asked, his voice shaking from the cold. "I heard you collect unusual Christmas items." His eyes darted around nervously as he spoke, like he was afraid someone might see him. I invited him into my warm sitting room, more curious about what he was carrying than about him. His hands trembled as he unwrapped the package, and I soon saw why. Inside was the most incredible mask I'd ever seen. It was made of dark, ancient wood, with twisted horns that curled up like a wild goat's. The face had sharp teeth carved into a cruel smile, and even though it was just a mask, the eyes seemed to follow me as I walked around it. "It's a real Krampus mask," the man whispered. "Been in my family for generations. Used in the winter festivals to punish bad children." He paused, swallowing hard. "But strange things happen around it. Children in our village started disappearing every Christmas. My own nephew." His voice trailed off. I should have been worried by his story. I should have asked more questions. But all I could think about was how perfect it would look in my collection. "How much?" I asked, already pulling out my purse. The man named his price, surprisingly low for such a rare piece. As he handed it to me, he grabbed my arm. "Be careful," he warned. "Sometimes at night, you can hear them crying." I laughed it off then. Rich ladies like me don't believe in silly superstitions. But that night, as I placed the mask in its new glass case, I could have sworn I heard a child's sob echo through the collection room. When I turned around, all my other pieces seemed to be watching me. That was just the beginning. I didn't know it then, but bringing that mask into my house would change everything, and not in the way I expected. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside my windows, but that wasn't what kept me awake. Something felt different about my house. I kept thinking about the Krampus mask and all my other collection pieces. Around midnight, I heard my maid Maria scream. I found her shaking in the hallway outside the collection room. "My lady," she whispered, "I heard children singing in there, but when I opened the door, it was empty." I told her she was being silly, but deep down, I felt scared too. I went into my collection room to prove there was nothing to worry about. As soon as I stepped inside, the temperature dropped so much I could see my breath. Walking past my glass cases, I noticed something odd. The old music box I bought last spring was playing by itself. It wasn't supposed to work anymore. That's why I got it so cheap. But there it was, tinkling out a Christmas carol. Then I saw the dolls. I collect old Christmas dolls, you see. They're usually sitting nicely in their case, but now, they were all facing the Krampus mask, every single one. I know I didn't put them that way. I ran to fix them. But when I touched the glass case, a child's handprint appeared in the frost that had formed there. My heart started beating so fast I thought it might burst. That's when I noticed the old book on my desk, the one where I write down the history of each piece in my collection. It had fallen open, and as I picked it up, I saw something terrifying. Every item I owned, a child had gone missing around the time I bought it. The porcelain doll from Vienna? A little girl vanished the day after I got it. The silver bell from Munich? 2 brothers disappeared that same week. Even my precious music box. A young street performer was never seen again after I bought it from that strange shop. I slammed the book shut, but I couldn't shut out the truth anymore. The voices I'd been hearing, the crying in the night, they weren't just my imagination. And now that the Krampus mask was here, they were getting louder. As I stood there, frozen with fear, all the glass cases started to rattle. The temperature dropped even more, and in the reflection of the nearest case, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Behind me, the Krampus mask's eyes were glowing red. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The room grew colder and colder until ice crystals formed on my dress. Then I heard it, a child's voice, clear as day. "She took my doll," the voice said. "I just wanted to hold it one more time." Another voice joined in. "The music box was mine. I played it on the street to earn money for my family." More voices started speaking, each one telling their story. They came from every piece in my collection. Each beautiful treasure I owned had a terrible secret. It had trapped the spirit of a child who once owned it. "You didn't care where they came from," a boy's voice accused. "You just wanted pretty things for your collection." I watched in horror as misty shapes began to form in front of each glass case. Children of all ages, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces sad and angry. Some I recognized from the missing children reports I'd ignored over the years. "Please," I begged. "I didn't know. I never meant to hurt anyone." But the spirits weren't listening anymore. They turned toward the Krampus mask, which was now shaking in its case. The glass shattered, and the mask floated into the air. Those red eyes burned brighter, and suddenly it wasn't just a mask anymore, it was alive. A deep voice rumbled through the room. "Lady Victoria Weatherby, you have stolen the joy from innocent children. You have trapped their spirits in your precious collection. Now it is time for judgment." The children's spirits moved closer, forming a circle around me. Each one held something from my collection, the things that had trapped them. The Krampus mask floated above them all, those terrible red eyes staring right into my soul. "Christmas Eve approaches," the deep voice continued. "The time when Krampus punishes the wicked. And you, Lady Weatherby, have been very, very wicked indeed." I tried to explain, to apologize, to beg for mercy. But as I opened my mouth to speak, I noticed something horrible happening to my hands. They were starting to look shiny, like polished wood and brass, like one of my collected treasures. The feeling spread from my hands through my whole body. It was like being dipped in cold metal, inch by inch. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Each child you trapped will now go free, the Krampus's voice boomed. But you must take their place. A collector should become part of her own collection. The children's spirits began to glow brighter. One by one, they floated to the things that had trapped them. But instead of going back in, they passed through them and became free. I watched as they smiled for the first time, their faces full of joy as they faded away like morning mist. Meanwhile, I felt myself getting smaller and smaller. My skin turned to polished wood and brass. My fine dress became tiny gears and springs. The last thing I saw was my reflection in a glass case. I was turning into a beautiful music box. For all time, Krampus declared, you will play the Christmas songs that brought these children joy before you stole it from them. Your music will remind others to keep kindness in their hearts during the holiday season. The transformation finished with a small click. Where I once stood was now an exquisite music box. Inside, where my heart used to be, a tiny figurine of a woman in a fine dress spins endlessly to Christmas carols. Maria found the collection room empty the next morning, except for one new music box. The spirits were gone. The Krampus mask had vanished. All the other pieces were just ordinary items now, no longer holding any trapped souls. They say if you listen carefully on Christmas Eve, somewhere in the Bavarian mountains, you can hear a music box playing. Its song is beautiful but sad, like someone trying to apologize over and over again. And sometimes, if you get really close, you might see a tiny figure spinning inside, her face frozen in a look of regret, forced to dance forever to the songs of the children she once collected. Remember my story, dear reader. Christmas is a time for giving and kindness, not for taking and greed, because you never know when Krampus might be watching, waiting to add another piece to his own collection of the wicked. 5 years later, the old mansion still stands on the mountain, covered in snow. Nobody lives there anymore, but sometimes tourists visit, hoping to see the famous music box from the stories they've heard. Last Christmas Eve, a young boy was exploring the house with his parents. In the dusty collection room, he found a beautiful music box sitting on a shelf. When he picked it up, it started to play by itself. Inside, a tiny woman in an old-fashioned dress spun around and around. The boy thought her face looked sad. As he listened to the music, he noticed other toys and old Christmas things scattered around the room. "Can I take something home, Mom?" he asked, reaching for a small wooden toy. But before he could touch it, the music box's song changed to a warning tune. The boy could have sworn he heard a woman's voice whisper, Please don't make my mistake." He put the music box back carefully. As his family left the room, the boy looked back one last time. In the fading light, he saw what looked like children's shadows dancing on the walls, finally free to play forever. And there in the corner, the tiny figure in the music box had stopped spinning for just a moment. Some say she was smiling, not a sad smile anymore, but a relieved one. After all, she had just saved someone from following her path. Now she had a new purpose: to protect others from the temptation of taking things that aren't theirs. Because even today, somewhere in that old house on the mountain, Lady Victoria Weatherby keeps spinning, playing her Christmas songs, and watching over her empty collection room. Just remember, if you ever visit and hear a music box playing by itself, pay attention to its song. It might be trying to tell you something important. My name is Johannes van Horn, and I was once the only toy maker in our small Dutch village by the sea. The year was 1678, and I lived alone in a crooked wooden house at the edge of town, where the cobblestone streets gave way to sandy paths leading to the beach. Every morning, I would wake up to the sound of seagulls and the distant crash of waves. My workshop filled the entire bottom floor of my house, with shelves lined with wooden horses, dolls, ships, and all sorts of toys that brought smiles to children's faces. The smell of fresh wood shavings and paint always filled the air, and sunlight streamed through my dusty windows, making the sawdust dance like tiny stars. I wasn't always alone. My dear wife Maria passed away 5 years ago, leaving me with nothing but my tools and my work. Perhaps that's why I put so much love into each toy I made. It helped fill the emptiness in my heart. The village children would press their noses against my workshop window, watching me carve and paint. Their excited whispers and bright eyes made my days less lonely. I was known as Uncle Johannes to most of the children, and parents would come to me whenever they needed a special gift. "Johannes's toys last forever," they would say. And it was true. I picked only the finest wood and took my time with each piece, making sure every toy was perfect. But everything changed the day after the great storm, when I found that strange piece of wood on the beach. If only I had known then what I know now, I would have left it where it lay, half buried in the wet sand. But how could I have guessed that a simple piece of driftwood would lead to such darkness? I remember that morning so clearly. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the air smelled of salt and rain. I had no idea that with each step I took toward that shipwreck, I was walking toward a nightmare that would change our village forever. That morning, I walked along the beach as I often did, looking for pieces of driftwood. The storm had been the worst I'd seen in years, the kind that made our houses creak and groan all night. As I walked, my feet sinking into the wet sand, I saw pieces of a ship scattered across the beach like broken toys. The tide was low, revealing dark wooden ribs of a ship's hull sticking out of the sand. Something about those timbers made me stop. They weren't like normal shipwreck wood. This wood was dark, almost black, and seemed to shine even though the sky was gray. My hands tingled when I touched it, like the feeling you get before lightning strikes. I found a piece that was just the right size for carving. It was oddly warm, despite being in the cold sea all night. I should have wondered about that, but all I could think about was what beautiful toys this wood would make. I tucked it under my arm and hurried home to my workshop. That's when the strange things started happening. As I worked with the wood, I noticed it was easier to carve than any wood I'd ever used. My tools sliced through it like it was butter, and the shapes seemed to appear by themselves, as if the wood wanted to become toys. The first thing I made was a simple rocking horse, painted white with red reins. Little Anna, the baker's daughter, saw it in my window the next day. Her father bought it for her 7th birthday. I remember how her eyes lit up when she saw it, how she hugged it close. I was so proud of my work that I didn't notice how her fingers wouldn't let go of the reins, or how her smile seemed a bit too wide. I went back to the beach 3 more times that week, bringing back more of that strange, dark wood. Each time the waves seemed to push new pieces right to my feet, as if the sea itself wanted me to find them. Each piece was warm to the touch, and sometimes, when my workshop was very quiet, I thought I could hear them humming. The toys I made from this wood were the most beautiful I'd ever created. They almost seemed alive. Dolls whose eyes appeared to follow you around the room. Tiny ships that rocked gently even when there was no breeze. Parents started coming from neighboring villages to buy them, and soon my workshop was busier than ever. But I should have known that something wasn't right. I should have noticed how the children who received these toys began to change. It started so slowly that at first, nobody saw the pattern. Not until it was almost too late. The worst part is, I kept carving. Even when my dreams filled with whispers and the sound of waves, even when my hands shook while working with that wood, I couldn't stop. Something about it pulled at me, like a song you can't get out of your head. And with each toy I made, I was spreading something dark through our village. Something that had waited centuries at the bottom of the sea. The changes in the children were small at first. Little Anna stopped playing outside with her friends, preferring to stay in her room with her rocking horse. Her mother told me Anna had started giving away her favorite things, her warm winter scarf, her mother's silver hairbrush, even her favorite doll that her grandmother had given her. She says her horse tells her that giving makes her special. Anna's mother whispered to me one gray morning, wringing her hands, "She hardly eats anymore. She just rocks back and forth on that horse, singing strange songs about the sea." Anna wasn't the only one. Young Peter, who had one of my new sailing ships, started leaving his toys on other children's doorsteps in the middle of the night. His father caught him trying to give away their family's precious Bible, saying it was what the ship wanted. The boy's face had grown pale, and dark circles appeared under his eyes like bruises. More parents came to me with worried faces. Their children weren't sleeping. They were giving away everything they owned. Some had started walking toward the beach at night, drawn to the waves like moths to a flame. When asked why, they all said the same thing: "We have to practice. The biggest gift is coming." I started watching the children more closely. In the town square, instead of playing their usual games, they would stand in circles, holding hands and whispering. Their toys, my cursed creations, were always with them. The wooden horses, ships, and dolls seemed to glow with a faint light that only the children could see. One evening I heard singing coming from the beach. A group of children stood in the shallow water, their feet bare despite the cold. They were singing an old song about St. Nicholas, but the words were wrong. Instead of bringing gifts, this St. Nicholas was collecting them, collecting children. My hands shook as I remembered the black wood from the shipwreck. The warm, humming pieces that had felt so alive. Could it be? Had I really found what I thought I had? The thought made my blood run cold. That night I couldn't sleep. The sound of waves seemed louder than ever, and I could have sworn I heard the toys in my workshop moving, their wooden parts clicking like bones. I lit a candle and went downstairs to look through my old books, searching for answers about shipwrecks and saints. What I found made my heart stop. There was a story, centuries old, about a ship carrying sacred relics that disappeared in a storm. Among its cargo were the remains of St. Nicholas himself. But these weren't holy relics anymore. The story said the saint's bones had been cursed by dark magic, transformed into something hungry and evil that sought to collect innocent souls as gifts. As I read this, I heard a child's laugh outside my window. When I looked up, I saw them, dozens of small figures moving through the dark streets, toys clutched in their arms, all heading toward the sea. Christmas Eve was coming, and with it, something terrible was awakening in our village. I had to do something. But how do you fight a curse that's centuries old? How do you save children from toys they love? Toys that I had made with my own hands. I knew I had to learn more about these cursed relics. The next morning, I visited Father Marcus, our village priest. His small church held the oldest books in our village, and he knew all the ancient stories. When I told him about the black wood and the children's strange behavior, his face turned white as a sheet. "Johannes," he whispered, his hands trembling as he pulled out a dusty book, "there are stories. Dark stories about a ship that sank near here long ago. It carried the remains of St. Nicholas, but something went wrong during the journey. The saint's desire to give gifts to children became twisted, corrupted by the dark waters. The book showed pictures that made my stomach turn. Children walking into the sea carrying gifts. A dark figure wearing a bishop's robe and rings, reaching up from the waves with skeletal hands. Everything matched what was happening in our village. I ran back to my workshop and tried to burn the remaining pieces of black wood. But they wouldn't catch fire. The flames just danced around them, turning blue and cold. When I tried to break them, my chisel bounced off like they were made of iron. That's when I heard the voice. It came from all the toys at once, a whisper that sounded like waves on sand. "Too late, toy maker. The children are our gifts now." I worked day and night trying to find a way to break the curse. I visited every child who had one of my cursed toys, begging their parents to destroy them. But the toys had a power over the children now. Any attempt to take the toys away made the children scream in pain and fever. The darkness was spreading. More children from nearby villages were coming to our town, drawn by the cursed toys. Each night, they would gather on the beach in larger numbers, practicing their gift-giving ceremony. They would exchange their toys, then walk into the shallow water before an adult could stop them. I discovered something else in Father Marcus's books. The curse could only be broken by someone who had helped spread it. That meant me, but the price would be high. The book said the curse would demand a trade, one soul for many. Christmas Eve was only 2 days away. In my dreams, I saw hundreds of children walking into the sea, disappearing beneath the waves while carrying my toys. I couldn't let that happen. I had started this by bringing that cursed wood into our village. Now I had to end. But as I made my plans, I could feel something watching me. The toys in my workshop had turned their painted eyes toward me. At night, I heard them whispering to each other in voices that sounded like children drowning. They knew I was trying to stop them, and they weren't going to make it easy. The next day, our village changed completely. Children I hadn't given toys to started acting strange too, as if the curse was spreading like a sickness. They began trading their normal toys for my cursed ones, and soon almost every child had something made from that evil black wood. I watched in horror as they played a new game in the town square. They stood in a circle, passing toys around, each child holding them for just a moment before giving them away. "Practice makes perfect," they chanted in flat voices. "The final gift must be just right." Parents tried locking their children in their rooms, but somehow they always got out. Some tried taking the toys away, but the children would just find them again, as if the cursed objects were calling to them. Those who managed to hide the toys found their children sleepwalking toward my workshop, scratching at my door like hungry cats. I tried everything I could think of. I nailed my workshop doors shut, but the toys inside somehow got out on their own. I threw some into the sea, but they washed back up on shore. I even tried breaking them with my strongest tools, but nothing worked. Each failed attempt just seemed to make the curse strong. That night I saw something that turned my blood to ice. Little Anna was standing outside my window, her rocking horse beside her. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, I saw something tall and dark, wearing a bishop's robe that dripped seawater. It had no face under its hood, just darkness and 2 glowing points of light like distant stars. On its skeletal hands, gold rings gleamed in the moonlight. "Tomorrow is Christmas Eve, Uncle Johann," Anna said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. "All the children will give their final gift. Won't you help us? After all, you're the one who made this possible." I slammed the shutters closed and sank to the floor, shaking. The curse was almost complete. Tomorrow night, all the children would try to give themselves to the sea. I knew then what I had to do, but the thought filled me with terror. The books had said the curse could be broken by trading one soul for many. I was the toy maker who had spread this evil through my work. Maybe, if I offered myself first, before the children could be taken, I could stop this nightmare. But as I thought this, I heard the toys laughing in the darkness of my workshop, as if they knew something I didn't. I spent that last night preparing. I gathered every bit of information I could find about St. Nicholas, the real one, not this twisted version the curse had created. I took the silver cross that had belonged to my wife Maria, and I wrote down everything that had happened, just in case I failed. As the sun began to set, I could hear singing coming from the beach. The children were gathering already. The time had come for my final confrontation with whatever dark thing was wearing St. Nicholas's face. But as I stepped out of my workshop, I realized with horror that I wasn't just fighting for the children of our village anymore. Through the mist, I could see more children arriving from every direction, carrying my cursed toys, all of them walking toward the sea. I started walking toward the beach, my wife's silver cross clutched in my hand. Behind me, I could hear the toys in my workshop start to move, their wooden parts clicking like bone. They were coming too. Everything would be decided tonight, one way or another. The beach was filled with children when I arrived. Hundreds of them stood in the shallow water, my cursed toys clutched in their arms. The moon was full, turning the sea silver. And in that light, I could see the dark wood of the toys glowing with a sickly green color. Little Anna stood at the front of the group, her rocking horse beside her. All the children were singing that twisted version of the St. Nicholas song, their voices hollow and strained. The waves seemed to sing with them, pushing harder against the shore with each verse. Then I saw it rise from the waves, the thing that had once been St. Nicholas. It was taller than any man, wearing a rotting bishop's robe that dripped seawater. Barnacles crusted its skeletal hands, but those golden rings still sparkled on its bony fingers. Where its face should have been, there was only darkness with two pale lights like distant stars. "Welcome, toy maker," it said in a voice that sounded like drowning. "You've brought me so many wonderful gifts." "They're not gifts," I said, holding up Maria's silver cross. "They're children, and I've come to take them back." The thing laughed, and all the toys laughed with it. "But you're the one who made this possible. Your hands carved their doom. Your heart gave the curse its power, and now they will all be mine." The children started walking deeper into the water. I ran forward, splashing through the waves, trying to reach them. But the cursed saint raised its hand, and seaweed wrapped around my legs, holding me in place. "You can still join us, Johannes," it said. "Think of how many toys we could make together, down in the deep. Think of all the gifts we could give." That's when I understood. This thing wasn't really St. Nicholas. It was a twisted reflection of him, created by centuries of darkness under the sea. The real St. Nicholas had been kind and generous. This thing was greedy, wanting to take rather than give. "The only gift you'll get from me," I said, "is this." I pulled out a wooden doll I'd made that morning, the last toy I'd ever make. But this one was different. I'd carved it from normal wood, and as I worked, I'd poured all my love for the children into it. All my guilt, all my hope, all my desire to make things right. When the cursed saint reached for the doll, I saw confusion in those star-like eyes. The doll began to glow with a warm golden light, the kind that comes from real love, not dark magic. The light spread across the water, touching each child, breaking the curse's hold. But as the children began to wake up and scramble back to shore, I felt those seaweed ropes pulling me deeper into the water. The curse needed a trade, one soul for many. As I was dragged toward the waves, I saw the children reaching safety on the beach. The last thing I saw was little Anna's face, her eyes clear and normal again, as skeletal hands wrapped in seaweed pulled me down into the dark water. They say no one in our village makes toys anymore. The children who survived that night grew up to become sailors, farmers, bakers, anything but toy maker. The cursed toys disappeared with me into the sea, though sometimes, after big storms, pieces of black wood still wash up on the shore. The villagers burn them immediately. Little Anna grew up to be the village school teacher. She tells children the true story of St. Nicholas, the kind one, the real one, who gave gifts out of love, not darkness. But she also warns them about strange toys and the sound of waves calling their name. Some nights, when the moon is full and the tide is high, people say they can see something moving beneath the waves, a figure in his workshop, still carving toys that will never begin. The children say it's just Uncle Johannes keeping watch, making sure no other dark things rise from the sea to claim. I know this because I'm still here, under the waves. The curse got what it wanted, one soul to save many. But that's the thing about real gifts. They come from love, not greed. My last gift saved the children, and somehow, that makes the darkness down here a little easier to bear. If you're ever walking on a beach and find a piece of wood that feels warm to your touch, that seems to hum with strange music, leave it where it lies. Some gifts are better left ungiven, some toys better left unmade. And if you hear waves calling your name, run as fast as you can toward home, because even now something dark and hungry still wears those bishop's rings, still searches for new gifts to collect, but it won't find them in our village. Not anymore. That's my gift to them, and it will last forever.